So picture this. The president of our local HOA kicks in my cabin door right as I'm sitting there drinking a cold beer with the state's attorney general. No warning, no knock, just a full-force boot straight through solid wood. Splinters flying everywhere, broken glass crunching under her designer heels, the whole insane scene unfolding in real time. And here's the part that makes it unbelievable. She committed 6 separate felonies in front of the one person in the entire state who could personally send her to prison. I'm talking about a woman in a $1,200 blazer, soaked in that sharp, expensive perfume that probably cost more than my monthly truck payment, storming into my grandfather's cabin, screaming about violations, authority, and jurisdiction like she owned the land. She had no clue who she'd just barged in on, no clue she was live streaming her own arrest to roughly 3,200 followers, and no clue that 6 months earlier, I thought she was just another power-hungry HOA bully. Turns out she was running a $4.6 million embezzlement operation, and I was seconds away from accidentally lighting her entire criminal empire on fire. So ask yourself this: what would you do if an HOA lunatic invaded your private property during the most important meeting of your life? Let me rewind, because this nightmare didn't start with a kicked-in door. 6 months earlier, life was damn near perfect. My name is Evan Brooks. I was 54 years old, freshly retired after 32 years of crawling through mud, trenches, and utility corridors, installing electrical infrastructure across 4 counties. Retirement was earned the hard way, and my reward was my grandfather's old fishing cabin on Pine Hollow Lake, 2 acres of untouched peace that my grandfather bought back in 1961 for exactly $900. $900 for lakefront land that's now worth more than most people's retirement accounts. It wasn't fancy, no luxury nonsense. Hand-cut logs, a stone fireplace my grandfather built himself, and a screen porch that creaked like it was alive. I kept it intentionally off-grid. Solar panels on the roof, well water cold and clean, and a septic system that ran smoother than half the city's infrastructure. Every morning, fog would lift off the lake like a curtain rising, and I'd remember why my grandfather chose that spot. He used to say, "Land chooses people, not the other way around." Then he'd add, "And if someone starts wanting your land real bad, you'd better find out why, because it's usually worth more than they're telling you." I didn't understand how right he was until she arrived. Her name was Lorraine Whitmore, though everyone eventually called her the HOA tyrant. She rolled into our quiet lake community like a wrecking ball in high heels. 60 years old, fresh out of some California subdivision where bullying neighbors was apparently a professional sport. She drove a pearl-white Cadillac Escalade with vanity plates that read "Enforce" and wore her HOA president badge like a lawman star. Her mission was simple: turn our rustic lakefront into what she called a premium resort community. What I didn't know at the time was that within 8 weeks of her arrival, 3 elderly couples had suddenly sold their cabins to unnamed cash buyers. Her opening move came early one Tuesday morning. I'm on the porch drinking coffee, watching loons teach their chicks how to dive, when I heard sharp clicking sounds on my dock. Heels at 7:05 a.m. on my private property. 10 minutes later, she taped an official notice to my screen door. A violation citation, unsightly dock structure, fine $550. Compliance required within 72 hours or daily penalties would begin. I stared at the paper like it was written in another language. That dock had been there longer than the association itself. I walked over to explain that my property predated the association by decades. She stood in my driveway, hands on her hips, and said, "Everyone on this lake answers to me. Ask the Parkers how pushing back worked out for them." The Parkers, my elderly neighbors, had sold their place the month before, after 24 years. That's when the unease settled in. She began photographing everything: my solar panels, my garden, my porch railings my grandfather carved by hand. Her SUV idled nearby, pumping out that chemical air freshener that made my stomach turn. By the end of the week, I had 3 more citations, each with higher fines. Lorraine had declared war on my land. I still thought it was just HOA nonsense. I had no idea I'd stepped into something far darker. 3 days after I ignored her deadline, a certified letter arrived. Cease and desist. Community waterway violation. The letterhead read Harrington and Lowe Legal Group, one of those firms with hourly rate could buy a used car. According to them, my dock illegally extended into community waters. I owed $3,400 in retroactive fees and had 10 days to pay or face a lien on my property. Panic hit until I remembered my grandfather's rule: never trust a letter, trust the records. So I went to the county courthouse, down into that dusty basement where truth gets buried. The clerk, Martha, remembered my grandfather from from fishing tournaments and helped me pull the original deeds. And there it was. The 1961 survey clearly showed my property extended 45 feet into the lake. The dock sat dead center on my land, and the HOA formed in 1999, nearly 36 years later. That dock was legally untouchable. I drove home feeling invincible. That feeling lasted until I tried to leave for groceries and found Lorraine's Escalade parked sideways across my driveway. Not near it, across it. I knocked, she cracked her window and said, "Just reviewing parking compliance. Might take a while." I was being detained in my own driveway by a woman with a clipboard and a god complex, and she was just getting started. Within a week, she launched the Lakeside Enhancement Committee, which was really just a pressure squad. Neighbors stopped waving, Facebook posts appeared about eyesore properties, the comments turned ugly. Privately, Miguel and Rosa Olivares admitted Lorraine had threatened them with inspections unless they complained about me. That night, my mailbox was spray-painted with the words "comply" or "sell." My hidden solar camera caught everything, her license plate clear as day at 2:17 a.m. When I called the sheriff, Deputy Logan Whitmore, her nephew, showed up, shrugged, and said it was probably kids. That was the moment I understood this wasn't a neighborhood dispute. This was a campaign, and I was just becoming the target. By the time I finished scrubbing orange paint off my mailbox, the message was already clear. Lorraine Whitmore wasn't bluffing. She wasn't just an HOA bully throwing paper threats around. She was methodical, coordinated, and absolutely confident no one would stop her. The following morning proved it. I woke up to another certified envelope taped to my door like a threat marker. This one wasn't from lawyers. It was from the county building department. Alleged unpermitted structures. Mandatory inspections scheduled for that afternoon. No request, no warning, just a time and a name. Dale Finch, building inspector. Dale was a guy I'd worked alongside years ago on municipal grid upgrades. Good man, straight shooter. When he arrived, the look on his face told me everything before he said a word. He didn't want to be there. He spent nearly 3 hours measuring, crawling, checking, documenting every inch of my cabin. When he finally closed his clipboard, he shook his head. Everything exceeded code. Electrical was better than most new builds. Structural integrity, solid. He muttered under his breath, "Whoever filed this is wasting county time," and left. That should have been the end of it. It wasn't even close. The next day brought environmental enforcement. A woman named Janice Keller showed up investigating reports that my septic system was contaminating the lake. She ran tests. Everything was clean. The system was functioning better than newer installations. She apologized before leaving. Then came the fire marshal, responding to an anonymous tip about hazardous solar wiring. He signed off without a single citation. 3 inspections in 3 days, all baseless, all documented, all creating a paper trail that made it look like my property was a recurring problem. That was the point. Bureaucratic harassment looks legitimate on record even when it's pure malice. While I dealt with inspectors, Lorraine went public. She landed herself a spot on Channel 9's Community Watch segment. The broadcast showed carefully framed shots of my cabin, angled to make it look neglected. She stood on my dock, the same dock she claimed was illegal, and talked about unsafe conditions and protecting children. Watching her lie on camera while standing on my property felt like swallowing broken glass. My phone exploded with angry texts. Neighbors I'd known for decades suddenly believed I was some kind of environmental threat. Half the lake turned on me overnight. That's when Caleb Alvarez, an old union friend, called. He'd seen the segment and laughed, told me Lorraine was full of garbage. Within 48 hours, he organized a group of 15 licensed electricians to come inspect my solar setup. They posted photos, documentation, and statements online backing my work. The hazardous narrative collapsed fast. But Lorraine didn't retreat. She escalated. A friend from high school, Rick Donovan, now a civil attorney, stopped by for a beer. He listened quietly as I laid everything out. Then he told me something that made my skin crawl. The state had ongoing investigations into HOA corruption, patterns exactly like mine. Elderly owners hit with violations, values suppressed, cash buyers swooping in. He said they needed documentation, witnesses, patterns, people like me. That night, I started logging everything. Dates, times, citations, calls, inspections, posts, messages. Every interaction became evidence. Digging into Lorraine's background opened another door. Her husband, Stephen Whitmore, wasn't just some local official. He was the state party finance coordinator. He had access to zoning forecasts, development plans, political leverage. That's when it clicked. This wasn't about dock aesthetics. It was about land acquisition, fear, pressure, cheap sales, development profit.
The harassment turned uglier. One night, someone spray-painted "Sell Now" across my shed. My camera caught Lorraine's Escalade passing minutes later. When I reported it, Deputy Logan Whitmore showed up again. Same shrug, same dismissal, probably kids. That's when I realized the system itself was compromised. Lorraine's next move was character assassination. A Facebook post accused me of aggressive behavior, claimed I was threatening HOA officials, told parents to keep kids away from my property. The post was shared 47 times in hours. The comments were vicious. What stood out was how many came from brand new profiles with stock photos, fake amplification, coordinated smear. 2 days later, she filed for a restraining order, alleging verbal threats, completely fabricated. The judge dismissed it for lack of evidence, but the damage stuck. My name was now attached to the word threat in a public court record. The pressure started to wear on me. Sitting on my grandfather's porch felt different, not peaceful, heavy, like I was guarding something under siege. Then the tide shifted. Support came from unexpected places. Retired Judge Henry Lawson, who'd known my grandfather, showed up with coffee and advice. He told me people don't wage campaigns like this over nothing. Money was involved. Big money. The local Veterans Post issued a statement backing me. The Historical Society highlighted my cabin as one of the last original lake structures. Environmental groups praised my sustainable setup. The decent part of the community started pushing back. That's when Lorraine went scorched earth. She somehow convinced the utility company to investigate irregularities in my power system. They cut service for 3 days while reviewing a perfectly legal grid tie. Then came false police reports, suspicious activity, noise complaints when I was alone, drug activity based on visitors who were clearly co-workers. Every call created another report, another mark. Deputy Logan always responded, always smirking. During one visit, he suggested I apologize and comply. That's when I understood Lorraine wasn't just punishing me, she was making an example. The breakthrough came during paperwork prep for my meeting with the Attorney General's office. One citation footer caught my eye. Fines payable to Lakeside Shores Community Renewal Fund, account number 83104. Something felt off. I went back to the county clerk. Martha pulled HOA filings. The numbers didn't add up. Over $295,000 collected in emergency dock assessments with no repairs completed. $160,000 paid to Whitmore Ground Services, a company registered 26 days after Lorraine became HOA president, owned by her brother-in-law. Insurance claims for storm damage on days with clear weather. Property management fees at $5,200 monthly paid to a shell company linked to her home address. It was fraud, blatant, organized. I photocopied everything with shaking hands. This wasn't harassment anymore. It was theft, systematic theft from every homeowner on the lake. Elderly couples weren't just forced out, they were robbed twice. Once through suppressed sales prices, again through fake fees. By nightfall, my grandfather's spare bedroom looked like an investigation office. Maps, timelines, financial trails. When prosecutors Laura Jennings and Mark Ellis arrived the next morning, they didn't waste time. They told me this case connected to others across the state. The FBI was already involved. They needed one thing more: real-time criminal behavior on record. And Lorraine was about to give it to them.
Once the prosecutors laid everything out, the tone shifted from neighborhood chaos to something colder and far more dangerous. Laura Jennings leaned over my grandfather's old oak table, spreading out copies of the HOA records like she was mapping a crime scene, while Mark Ellis quietly connected dates, payments, and shell companies with a precision that made my skin prickle. They explained that Lorraine Whitmore's operation matched patterns the state had been tracking for years: HOA leaders with political insulation using harassment to depress property values, while siphoning money through fake vendors, insurance scams, and manufactured emergency assessments. My documentation didn't just support the theory, it filled the gaps. But they needed more. Paper trails alone could get indictments, sure, but to dismantle everything cleanly, they wanted her caught in the act, committing crimes in real time. That's when they told me about federal involvement. An FBI agent from the white-collar unit had been looped in, monitoring similar schemes in multiple counties. My case was the missing link tying them together. The plan was simple and terrifying. Let Lorraine do what she always did when she felt threatened: escalate, overreach, self-destruct. They didn't need to provoke her. Her own obsession with control would do the work for them. All we had to do was document it properly and make sure law enforcement was ready when she crossed the line. And she crossed lines like it was a hobby.
The escalation came fast. Within days, my solar system began malfunctioning, batteries drained overnight, error codes flashing that made no sense. When my electrician friend Caleb came out, he found connections loosened just enough to disrupt power without obvious damage. Professional sabotage, not random. He photographed everything, then quietly installed a hidden camera near the panel. 2 nights later, at 2:48 a.m., the footage caught Lorraine creeping onto my property with a flashlight and tools, cigarette glowing in the dark. Clear as day. HOA president sabotaging private infrastructure under cover of night. That should have been enough to stop her. Instead, it emboldened her. Next came the dock. I returned from town to find my boat drifting loose, chains cut clean with bolt cutters. The hull scraped against rocks on the far shore, paint scarred, engine coughing water. That boat wasn't just equipment, it was my grandfather's pride, bought decades ago and maintained like a family heirloom. Seeing it damaged felt personal, like she'd reached back through time to spit on his memory. The sheriff logged it as vandalism, another report, another incident. Lorraine wasn't hiding anymore, she was daring someone to stop her. Then she went after the septic system. One morning, the smell hit before I even opened the door. Sewage backing up, eyes burning from chemical fumes. Emergency services confirmed industrial-grade drain chemicals had been poured into the system, killing the bacteria and causing a toxic backup. The repair bill was $3,200, but more importantly, the technician documented everything. This wasn't mischief, it was deliberate destruction using specialized materials, criminal sabotage, and every move she made was being logged, photographed, recorded, time-stamped. While she vandalized, she amplified the narrative online. Dozens of fake accounts flooded local forums with identical complaints about my deteriorating property and dangerous behavior. The posts hit in waves, minutes apart, clearly automated. At the same time, patrol cars began circling my cabin more often. Deputy Logan Whitmore drove by 4 or 5 times a day, slowing enough to make it obvious. Sometimes he'd park at the end of my drive and sat there running plates of anyone who stopped by. The intimidation wasn't subtle anymore. It was a message to me and anyone considering standing with me. And Lorraine didn't stop with me. Caleb's contractor license was suddenly under review. Judge Lawson received a bar complaint accusing him of improper legal advice. The Veterans Post got hit with surprise inspections. The Historical Society faced zoning complaints. Anyone who backed me became a target. It was retaliation on a community-wide scale, meant to isolate me and scare everyone else silent. The stress became constant, metallic, like a bad taste that never left my mouth. But for investigators, every act of retaliation was more evidence, more charges stacking up. That's when the final plan came together. The Attorney General herself agreed to meet me at the cabin. Symbolic, they said, a statement, and they were certain Lorraine wouldn't be able to interfere. Hidden cameras were installed throughout the cabin, undercover officers positioned around the lake, coordination across agencies tightened. The goal wasn't confrontation, it was documentation. Lorraine's ego would take care of the rest. She sensed it. Her behavior shifted from calculated to frantic. She made threatening calls to neighbors, warning them about consequences for cooperating with authorities. Each call was recorded. She ranted online about conspiracies, about government persecution. Then came the live stream announcements. She was going to expose corruption. She was going to confront powerful people. She framed herself as a victim of political revenge. But what she didn't know was that warrants had already been issued for her digital communications. Every message, every post, every plan was visible to investigators. The night before the meeting, I sat alone on the porch, lake, glassy and quiet, thinking about how far this had gone. What started as a dock citation had turned into federal investigations and criminal charges waiting to drop. The cabin felt heavier, charged with anticipation. By morning, everything would change. Whether I walked away free or broken depended entirely on Lorraine doing what she always did when she felt cornered, and she did. The sound of her Escalade tearing up my driveway that morning was unmistakable. Gravel sprayed, doors slammed, voices shouted about camera angles. She had brought a crew. Her live stream was already rolling as she stomped toward my door, fury building for an audience she believed was cheering her on. Inside, the Attorney General sat calmly at the table, reviewing documents, unbothered. Hidden cameras blinked silently. Law enforcement listened from every direction. All we could do was wait. The first crash of her foot against the door shook the cabin. The second broke it. Wood exploded inward, glass shattered, and Lorraine Whitmore stormed into my living room with phone raised, shouting accusations of corruption and persecution. She didn't see the badge until it was too late. The moment the Attorney General stood and identified herself, Lorraine's face drained of color. Her live audience watched in real time as realization hit. Federal agents stepped in. Charges were read. Handcuffs closed. Her phone clattered to the floor, still broadcasting her collapse to thousands of stunned viewers. The war was over the instant she kicked that door. She just didn't know it yet.
The moment the handcuffs snapped shut around Lorraine Whitmore's wrists, something invisible broke across the lake, like a pressure system finally releasing. Her phone lay face up on my living room floor, still live, still broadcasting her arrest to an audience that had dropped from thousands of cheering supporters to a swarm of stunned spectators watching a public implosion. Federal Agent Torres calmly reached down and ended the stream herself, like she was closing a book that had already told its ending. Lorraine kept shouting about jurisdiction, about rights, about how this was all a setup, but the words were hollow now, bouncing uselessly off the log walls my grandfather had built decades earlier. The Attorney General didn't raise her voice once. She simply listed the charges: criminal trespass, breaking and entering, fraud, extortion, witness intimidation, conspiracy, each one landing heavier than the last. Outside, neighbors gathered on the porch and near the dock, drawn by the noise, watching in silence as the woman who had terrorized them for months was escorted out of my cabin in cuffs. Lorraine tried one last time to project authority as they walked her past the porch. She straightened her blazer, lifted her chin, and hissed that this wasn't over, that her husband would fix it, that powerful people were about to make calls. Nobody reacted. Not the agents, not the Attorney General, not the neighbors. Her Escalade, the same one she used to block driveways and intimidate residents, was already being hooked to a tow truck as evidence. The vanity plate that once looked smug now just looked pathetic. When the vehicle disappeared down the road, a strange quiet settled over the water. No applause, no cheers, just the sound of loons calling across the lake like they always had. The days that followed were a blur of statements, interviews, and subpoenas. Investigators worked out of my cabin like it was a temporary command post. Boxes of documents were carried out, hard drives cataloged, phones logged. Lorraine's financial web unraveled faster than anyone expected. The shell companies, the fake invoices, the insurance claims tied to storms that never happened. It all collapsed under scrutiny. The Community Improvement Fund turned out to be nothing more than a personal slush account. Over 2 years, hundreds of thousands of dollars had been siphoned off while residents were told repairs were pending. Each discovery widened the case, pulling in contractors, accountants, and eventually political operatives who thought HOA money was too small and obscure to attract real attention. Stephen Whitmore didn't last long once investigators followed the trail to him. His access to zoning forecasts and development plans suddenly looked a lot less like coincidence. Emails surfaced, messages coordinating pressure campaigns and purchase timelines. He resigned quietly at first, hoping it would all blow over. It didn't. Within weeks, formal charges were filed. The political insulation Lorraine had relied on evaporated overnight. Friends stopped answering calls. Former allies distanced themselves. The machine she'd built turned on her the second it became inconvenient. The HOA itself didn't survive the investigation. Emergency meetings were called. Board members resigned en masse once they realized how deep the fraud went. The association was formally dissolved under court supervision, its remaining funds frozen pending restitution. In its place, the community formed a voluntary lake association. No enforcement powers, no fines, no mandatory fees. Just neighbors coordinating dock maintenance and shoreline cleanup the way they had before Lorraine ever arrived. The change was immediate. Tension lifted. People waved again. Conversations returned to weather, fishing, and whose grill was firing up that weekend. 3 months later, I sat in a federal courtroom as sentencing was handed down. Lorraine stood smaller than I remembered, stripped of the confidence that once fueled her. The judge didn't rush. He laid out the scope of the damage, the number of families affected, the calculated nature of the crimes. Then he sentenced her to 3 years in federal prison, ordered $360,000 in restitution, and imposed a lifetime ban from serving on any HOA board or similar governing body. Stephen followed not long after, taking 18 months for conspiracy and abuse of office. The courtroom was silent as it sank in. This wasn't a slap on the wrist. It was an ending. Justice didn't stop there. The evidence from our lake triggered audits in neighboring counties. Similar schemes surfaced. Other HOA presidents resigned preemptively. A few were arrested.
The pattern Lorraine thought was invisible turned out to be widespread, and my case became the reference point investigators used to connect them all. The Attorney General's office drafted new legislation based on what they uncovered: mandatory financial audits, criminal penalties for harassment-based property manipulation, real oversight where none had existed before. Watching something with my name attached passed into law felt surreal. I'd never set out to be a whistleblower. I just refused to be pushed off land my grandfather trusted me to protect. The community healed faster than I expected. Families who had sold under pressure started returning. Properties that had been flipped under fraudulent pretenses were challenged and reversed. Values rebounded, not because of forced improvements, but because people wanted to live where they weren't afraid. Mrs. Patterson moved back to Florida and cried the first time she unlocked her old door again. The Hendersons bought a cabin 2 lots down and invited everyone over for a frisch fry that lasted until midnight. Laughter returned to the shoreline. As for me, the federal whistleblower compensation check arrived quietly in the mail. $48,000 tied to recovered funds. It felt less like a reward than reimbursement for months of stress and damage. I used part of it to restore my dock properly, reinforcing the same boards my grandfather and I would once worked on together. I set aside another portion to create a small trade school scholarship in his name, something practical, something he would have respected. The rest I left untouched, a reminder that the fight had cost something real. The cabin feels like itself again now. Mornings are quiet, coffee tastes right. The solar panels hum without interruption. No inspectors, no citations, no anonymous complaints. Just water against wood and wind through trees. Sometimes I sit on the porch at sunset and think about how close it came to going the other way, how easily intimidation works when no one pushes back. Lorraine counted on isolation, on fatigue, on people choosing the easier path of silence. She never expected documentation, never expected someone stubborn enough to keep records and ask questions. I didn't beat her alone. The truth did. Paper trails, timelines, receipts, the boring, unglamorous stuff that criminals always underestimate. When people ask how to fight an HOA nightmare, I tell them it starts with writing everything down and refusing to believe you're powerless. Because the moment Lorraine kicked that door, she proved something important. Authority without legitimacy collapses the second it's challenged by facts. The lake is calm tonight. Lights glow softly from cabins that once stood dark. The war that consumed months of my life is over, not with shouting or revenge, but with quiet accountability. And that feels like the right ending.
I thought everything would slow down after the sentencing, that once the courtroom doors closed on Lorraine Whitmore, the chaos would finally fade into memory. But I was wrong. The arrest ended her control, not the consequences. The fallout rolled through the lake community like aftershocks from a buried fault line finally snapping. Every day brought new revelations, new names, new neighbors realizing how close they'd come to losing everything without ever understanding why. Investigators kept returning to my cabin, not because I was in trouble, but because it had become the center point where all the threads crossed. Financial analysts, insurance auditors, zoning specialists, even federal tax examiners sat at my grandfather's old table, flipping through documents and shaking their heads. Lorraine's operation hadn't just stolen money, it had poisoned trust, and undoing that damage took time. The first real shockwave hit when the restitution process began. Families received official letters explaining how much they were owed and why. Some checks were small, a few thousand here and there. Others were life-changing. The Thompsons, who'd been pressured into selling their cabin for almost 30% below market value, were awarded compensation tied to fraudulent valuation suppression. Mrs. Patterson received reimbursement for years of fake emergency assessments she'd paid out of fear. Watching neighbors open envelopes with trembling hands, some crying, some laughing in disbelief, made the scope of Lorraine's theft feel painfully real. This wasn't just numbers on spreadsheets. It was groceries skipped, trips canceled, savings drained by lies. At the same time, the legal machine kept grinding forward. Subpoenas expanded. Contractors who'd submitted fake invoices started flipping on each other to avoid prison time. Insurance adjusters admitted claims were approved based on falsified reports supplied by HOA leadership. The phrase isolated incident vanished from every conversation. What investigators uncovered was a coordinated system that relied on intimidation, political shielding, and the assumption that no one would ever dig deep enough to connect the dots. My lake was just one node in a network that spanned counties. Knowing that my refusal to back down had helped expose something much larger than myself sat heavy on my shoulders.
The attention brought its own pressure. Reporters showed up unannounced, cameras pointed at my porch like it was some kind of landmark. I declined most interviews, not out of secrecy, but because I didn't want to turn this into a spectacle. Still, the story spread. Articles framed it as a rare case of an HOA president being held criminally accountable. People from other states started reaching out, sharing their own stories of harassment, fines, threats, and forced sales. Reading those messages late at night, I realized how common this abuse was and how rarely it ended with consequences for the people in power. The Attorney General's office invited me to attend hearings as an observer when new oversight measures were debated. Sitting in those rooms felt surreal. Lawmakers referenced my documentation, my timeline logs, my photographs as justification for reforms. They spoke about transparency and accountability like they were abstract ideas, but to me, they were faces, cabins, families I knew. When the bill mandating independent HOA audits passed its final vote, there was no applause, just a quiet understanding that something broken had finally been acknowledged. Back at the lake, healing happened in smaller, more personal ways. Neighbors started knocking on my door again, not with complaints or warnings, but with apologies. Some admitted they'd believed Lorraine's posts, others said they'd been scared. I didn't hold it against them. Fear works best when it's shared. What mattered was that they were here now, helping rebuild what had been fractured. Weekend cleanup crews formed without formal meetings or authority. Docks were repaired cooperatively, paths cleared. Kids played freely along the shoreline again without parents whispering about violations or fines. The voluntary association took shape naturally. No president, no board with unchecked power, just rotating coordinators handling specific tasks. Decisions made in daylight with everyone invited to listen. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. Watching that structure grow out of the wreckage of the old HOA made me understand something Lorraine never did. Control isn't community, trust is. Personally, the exhaustion hit me late. Once the adrenaline faded, the months of tension settled into my bones. I slept longer, woke up slower. Some mornings the quiet felt almost too quiet, like my body was waiting for another crisis that never came. Sitting on the porch, beers sweating in my hand, I'd catch myself listening for the sound of an engine roaring up the drive or heels clicking on wood. When nothing happened, relief followed, then a strange sadness that so much peace had been interrupted in the first place. I used part of the whistleblower money to restore what Lorraine damaged. The dock chains were replaced, the boat repaired and repainted, its engine tuned until it purred like it used to when my grandfather ran it across the lake at dawn. The septic system was rebuilt stronger than before, documented down to the last bolt, not because I feared inspections, but because I refused to let sabotage define the condition of my home. Each repair felt like reclaiming a piece of time she'd tried to steal. One evening, as the sun dropped low and painted the water copper, Mrs. Patterson walked down the path carrying a pie. She sat with me on the porch and told me stories about my grandfather I'd never heard, about fishing contests, about how he'd once loaned his boat to a stranger without hesitation. She said he would have been proud, not because I fought, but because I stayed. Her words landed deeper than any courtroom verdict. The last official visit from investigators came quietly. They returned borrowed documents, thanked me, and told me the case files were officially closed. Convictions secured, funds distributed, oversight measures in place. When their cars disappeared down the road, I stood alone by the dock and let the finality sink in. For the first time in a long while, there was nothing left to prepare for. That night, the lake was still. No sirens, no flashing lights, just water and stars. I realized the real victory wasn't Lorraine's prison sentence or the legislation or even the money returned. It was this moment, the absence of fear, the knowledge that intimidation had failed because someone documented the truth and refused to surrender it. The nightmare had ended, not with destruction, but with quiet resolve. And as I sat there, listening to the loons call across the dark water, I knew there was still more to tell about what came after, about how the ripples spread far beyond our shoreline.
Once the investigators officially closed the case, I thought the story would naturally fade into a quiet footnote of local history. But that wasn't how it unfolded. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged, like the moment after a storm when people finally step outside to assess what's still standing. Word spread beyond our lake faster than I expected. Nearby communities started reaching out, not out of curiosity, but desperation. Men and women who sounded exhausted before they even finished introducing themselves. Retirees buried under fines they never understood. Young families threatened with liens over playground equipment. Widows scared into selling homes they'd lived in for decades. They all told the same story with different names attached. An HOA president, a board stacked with loyalists, citations used like weapons, fear doing the real work. Listening to them felt like reliving the nightmare from a different angle over and over again. I didn't plan on getting involved again. I wanted my life back. But it's hard to ignore people when you know exactly what they're facing and how alone it feels. So I started answering emails, then phone calls. I shared templates for record keeping, advice on public filings, warnings about intimidation tactics. I told them the same thing every time. Write everything down, trust documents over threats, and never assume the person yelling the loudest has real authority. I wasn't giving legal advice. I was giving survival instructions. Slowly, patterns emerged. The same law firms, the same insurance carriers, the same shell vendors popping up under different names. It became obvious Lorraine hadn't invented the playbook. She'd just followed it aggressively. A few months later, I was invited to speak at a regional homeowner rights forum. I almost said no. Public speaking had never been my thing, and the idea of standing in front of strangers talking about the worst period of my life didn't sit well. But when I saw the room, packed with people clutching folders just like I once had, I understood why I needed to be there. I didn't dramatize anything. I laid out the timeline, the citations, the inspections, the financial footers no one looks at. You could feel the shift as people realized harassment wasn't random. It was procedural, designed, and therefore beatable. By the end, several attendees were already exchanging information, forming their own support networks before even leaving the building. Back home, the lake continued to transform. Without constant pressure, creativity returned. Someone organized a floating movie night. Another neighbor started teaching kids how to kayak. The annual festival, once canceled under Lorraine's reign because it violated community standards, came back bigger than ever. Food trucks lined a road, music carried across the water. Veterans from the local post set up a fundraiser for housing assistance, raising enough in one night to fund multiple projects. Standing there with a plate of barbecue, watching families laugh where tension once ruled, felt like witnessing something reclaimed rather than created. I also started seeing the personal cost more clearly. During the worst of the harassment, I'd been running on adrenaline and anger. Only after things settled did I notice how deeply it had cut. Sleep came unevenly. Loud noises still made my shoulders tense. Some evenings, the quiet itself felt suspicious. It took time to relearn what peace actually sounded like. Working with my hands helped. I rebuilt sections of the porch, not because they needed it, but because the rhythm grounded me. Measure, cut, fit. Solid steps that made sense when everything else felt chaotic. One afternoon, I found an old notebook my grandfather used to keep tucked in a drawer. Fishing notes, weather observations, small reminders scribbled in the margins. One line stood out, written years before he died. Land only stays yours if you're willing to stand on it. At the time, I thought he meant physically. Now I understood it differently. Standing on land meant standing on truth, on records, on memory, on refusing to let louder voices rewrite reality. The ripple effects kept spreading. A county 2 hours away dissolved its HOA under investigation before charges were even filed, citing our case as precedent. Another community successfully challenged years of improper fines after uncovering financial discrepancies modeled exactly like ours. Each win reinforced the same lesson. Systems built on intimidation collapse the moment transparency is forced on them. I didn't celebrate those victories loudly. I absorbed them quietly, like proof that what happened here mattered beyond my dock and my cabin. There were setbacks, too. Some people couldn't face the fight. A few sold anyway, choosing peace over justice. I didn't judge them. Everyone has a limit. The important thing was that now the choice was theirs, not forced by fear. That distinction mattered more than any courtroom outcome. Control had shifted back to the people who actually lived there. Late one evening, as the lake reflected a sky full of stars, I realized something else had changed. I wasn't angry anymore. Not at Lorraine, not even at the system that enabled her.
Anger had fueled the fight, but it wasn't meant to last. What replaced it was something steadier, resolve, the kind that doesn't need noise to sustain itself. I could sit on the porch, listen to the water, and know that if someone tried again, here or somewhere else, the blueprint to stop them already existed. The cabin felt like more than a home now. It was a marker, proof that intimidation fails when confronted methodically. People still stop by, not as pilgrims or fans, but as neighbors, needing reassurance that they're not crazy for questioning authority. I tell them the same thing every time. Power hates records. Bullies hate timelines. Truth doesn't need permission to exist. Those aren't slogans. They're observations paid for with stress, time, and a door that once lay shattered across my living room floor. As summer rolled towards fall, the lake settled into a rhythm that felt earned. Boats moved lazily across the water. Children jumped off docks without worrying who might complain. Sunsets stretched long and uninterrupted. I found myself grateful not just for what I'd protected, but for what I'd learned. The fight had changed me, but it hadn't hardened me. If anything, it clarified what was worth defending and what was worth letting go. And as I sat there, watching the light fade and thinking about how many other places were still trapped under the kind of control we'd broken here, I knew there was still one more part of this story left to tell.
The attention didn't fade the way I thought it would. It changed shape. Once the trials wrapped and the audits became public record, larger media outlets started circling, not because they cared about my cabin or my dock, but because the case exposed something systemic that made good headlines. Journalists framed it as a rare collapse of HOA abuse backed by hard evidence instead of rumor. Crews came and went, setting up cameras where inspectors once stood, asking me to repeat timelines I knew by heart. I stuck to facts, dates, numbers, documents. Every time someone tried to steer the story toward inspiration or morality, I redirected it back to records and actions. Lorraine hadn't fallen because of outrage. She fell because everything she did left a trail. That distinction mattered. It kept the story from turning into entertainment and kept it anchored in reality, where consequences live. That was how the documentary deal happened, quietly and almost accidentally. A small production team reached out first, saying they were compiling material on community corruption cases. They spent a week reviewing files before ever turning on a camera. When they realized how complete the documentation was, they expanded the scope. Interviews followed, not just with me, but with former neighbors, investigators, auditors, and families who'd been pushed out. Nothing was reenacted, nothing dramatized. The footage was slow, procedural, and uncomfortable in the way truth often is. When a larger streaming platform picked it up months later, I didn't celebrate. I negotiated conditions. No exaggerated titles, no caricatures. Lorraine's name could appear, but only in relation to charges and convictions. The story wasn't about humiliation, it was about exposure. Filming changed the energy around the lake again, but this time it wasn't hostile. People understood what was happening. Cameras stayed off private docks and less invited. Kids learned quickly to ignore microphones. The crew documented the contrast between what the community had been under Lorraine and what it looked like now. No citations, no fear, just ordinary life. That contrast spoke louder than any narration ever could. When filming wrapped, the crew packed up and left behind something unexpected, a sense that the chapter had truly closed. In the months that followed, the legal ripples kept spreading. Several insurance companies revised their claim approval processes after auditors flagged how easily they'd been manipulated. A regional law firm quietly dissolved after internal reviews revealed a pattern of enabling HOA harassment without due diligence. State regulators issued new guidance on lien filings, tightening standards that had once been loosely enforced. None of it made headlines, none of it needed to. The machinery adjusted itself once it was forced into the light. Closer to home, people who'd once avoided eye contact now lingered to talk. Some admitted they'd ignored red flags because confronting authority felt risky. Others said they'd convinced themselves the fines were legitimate because they came on official letterhead. Those conversations weren't confessions, they were acknowledgments of how easily intimidation masquerades as order. Hearing them reinforced something I'd learned the hard way. Systems don't need everyone's cooperation to function, they just need enough silence. The voluntary association matured into something stable. Maintenance schedules posted publicly, budgets discussed openly, no penalties, no enforcement. Participation rose because no one felt coerced. It wasn't efficient in the corporate sense, but it worked. Problems were handled face-to-face instead of through noticed-as-taped doors. That alone eliminated most conflict. Watching it operate confirmed what Lorraine never grasped. Authority that depends on fear collapses the moment fear is removed. I kept getting messages from people across the country, some asking for help, others just sharing their own experiences. I answered what I could, ignored what I couldn't, and stayed careful not to turn into a symbol or leader. I wasn't interested in running anything. I was interested in ensuring what happened here didn't get rewritten into something easier to swallow. The danger of stories like this is how quickly they get simplified. Bad person, good outcome, lesson learned. Reality was messier. Lorraine hadn't been powerful because she was evil. She'd been powerful because systems around her didn't require verification. That was the part worth remembering. The last official reminder of the old HOA came when the court-approved restitution process finished. The final checks went out, accounts closed, archives, records. A notice arrived confirming the association's dissolution was complete. I folded it and put it away without ceremony. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like maintenance, like replacing a rotten beam before it takes the whole structure down. On a practical level, life returned to routines I'd almost forgotten. Morning coffee on the porch without scanning the road. Grocery trips without worrying about what I'd come home to. Even small things like not flinching when a car slowed near my driveway felt significant. The body remembers stress long after the mind declares it over. It took time to unlearn vigilance. I didn't rush it. I let normalcy return at its own pace. One afternoon, months after filming ended, I found the broken pieces of my door stored in the shed. I'd kept them without thinking, stacked against the wall like evidence I no longer needed. I carried them down to the lake and burned them safely, watching splintered wood turn to ash. It wasn't symbolic in a dramatic sense. It was practical. Debris doesn't belong in storage once its purpose is served. The documentary premiered quietly, without fanfare. I watched it alone, more out of obligation than interest. Seeing events laid out sequentially, stripped of emotion, confirmed something important. The story didn't need embellishment. The facts were enough. Lorraine's actions, recorded and contextualized, spoke for themselves. When the credits rolled, I turned it off and went back outside. The lake looked the same as it always had. That was the point. Weeks later, a check arrived from the production company as part of the agreement. I deposited it and forgot about it. Money wasn't the metric anymore. Stability was. Predictability. The absence of threats disguised as governance. When people asked what it felt like to win, I didn't have an answer that fit the question. There was no final blow, no moment of triumph, just a gradual return to ground that had never stopped being solid beneath the noise. As summer tipped toward fall again, I realized there was only one part of this story left, the quiet aftermath most people never hear about. What happens when the cameras leave, the cases close, and the system that failed once has to prove it can work without coercion. That ending didn't involve villains or heroes. It involved vigilance, memory, and refusing to let convenience replace accountability ever again. By the time the second anniversary of Lorraine Whitmore's arrest rolled around, the lake no longer felt like the site of a battle that had been won. It felt like a place that had simply returned to what it was always meant to be. The documentary had come and gone, streaming its way through living rooms far beyond our shoreline, stirring outrage in some viewers and quiet recognition in others. After the initial wave of messages tapered off, life settled into a rhythm so ordinary it felt almost luxurious. Mornings began with mist lifting slowly off the water, evenings ended with docks creaking softly under bare feet, and the space in between was filled with work that mattered and silence that didn't feel threatening anymore. The absence of constant conflict created room for something I hadn't realized I'd lost during those months of harassment: the ability to plan more than a week ahead without bracing for impact. I could schedule repairs, invite friends, even leave town for a few days without worrying what I'd come back to. That kind of freedom isn't loud, but once you get it back, you notice every second you didn't have it. The lake community matured in subtle ways. People didn't just return, they invested emotionally again. Gardens expanded, docks got fresh coats of paint. New families moved in, not because of forced upscale transformation, but because word had spread that this was a place where neighbors actually looked out for each other. The voluntary association held its meetings outdoors when the weather allowed. Folding chairs arranged in loose circles, kids running in and out of conversations without anyone worrying about liability forms or compliance notices. Decisions took longer sometimes, but when they were made, everyone knew how and why. Transparency slowed things down, but it also prevented the rot that had once grown unchecked. I noticed how differently people talked about authority now, not with automatic suspicion, but not with blind trust either. Questions were asked, records requested, budgets reviewed. It wasn't hostile, it was attentive. Lorraine's shadow lingered just enough to remind everyone what happens when no one pays attention. The system didn't need fear anymore to keep people engaged. Memory did the job. On a personal level, I started letting go of the role I'd slipped into during the fight.
For a long time, being the guy who stood up to the HOA had followed me everywhere. It wasn't a title I'd asked for, and I was careful not to cling to it. I didn't want my identity defined by a conflict that was already over. Slowly, conversations shifted back to normal things: weather patterns, fishing conditions, who needed help fixing a roof. That felt like progress. When people stopped asking about court dates and started asking about barbecue plans, I knew the community had healed more than any legislation could guarantee. There were moments when the scale of what had happened still hit me unexpectedly. I'd be sorting old paperwork and stumble across a citation notice, or see the account number from the fake community fund scribbled in my logs and feel a flash of disbelief. All of that pressure, all that fear, generated by a system built on paper threats and assumed obedience. It reinforced a lesson I carried forward quietly. Intimidation thrives on speed and confusion. It dies under slow, methodical attention. That wasn't wisdom I'd sought out, but it was one I wouldn't forget. The cabin itself aged back into comfort. Repairs blended into the original structure until it was hard to tell where damage had once been. The door that Lorraine kicked in had been replaced months ago, but sometimes I'd run my hand along the frame, remembering how fragile authority had looked the moment it crossed from paperwork into physical force. That single act, one impulsive kick, had undone years of manipulation because it stripped away plausible deniability. Everything after that had simply followed the evidence. It reminded me how often people with power rely on staying just inside technical lines, and how quickly they fall when emotion pushes them over. I spent more time on the water again. Early mornings with a rod in hand, the boat moving slowly through fog, felt like conversations with my grandfather across time. He trusted me with this place without ever imagining the kind of fight it would require. Protecting it hadn't meant violence or confrontation in the traditional sense. It meant patience, records, and refusing to be rushed into bad decisions. Standing on that water, listening to loons echo across the surface, I understood his old sayings in a way I never had before. Land chooses people, yes, but it also tests them. The broader impact of the case continued quietly. Every so often I'd hear about another HOA audit triggered by the reforms, another board forced to explain missing funds, another harassment campaign stopped early because residents recognized the signs. Those weren't victories I could see from my porch, but knowing they existed gave the whole ordeal a shape beyond my own experience. What happened here wasn't an anomaly, it was an example, and examples matter more than speeches. Eventually, even the documentary faded into background noise, just another title in a crowded library of content. That didn't bother me. The goal had never been attention, it had been resolution. Closure came not from applause or recognition, but from continuity, from watching the lake move through seasons unchanged by human drama. Snow dusted the docks in winter, spring rains raised the waterline, summer brought laughter back in waves. The place endured, as it always had, indifferent to who tried to control it. Now, when I sit on the porch at night, beer sweating in my hand, I don't replay arguments or courtrooms. I listen to wind, to water, to the quiet proof that intimidation failed. The story didn't end with a villain in prison or a law passed in a Capitol building. It ended with normalcy restored and vigilance quietly woven into everyday life. That's not a dramatic ending, but it's a real one, and it's the kind that lasts.